Cristo Crucificato is one of the most famous paintings of Christ's crucifixion. Diego Velázquez was a famous Spanish painter in the 1600s. He most likely painted the Cristo Crucificato in 1632, and he did it for a convent in Madrid. The interesting thing about this particular painting is even though he painted it for this convent, here in the Americas, this painting became legendary. This painting became hope for... Got the picture? There we go. This painting became a painting of hope for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Velázquez was the leading artist in the king's court. So there was this big contrast between why he painted it, who he was, what he was doing in Madrid and in Spain and for the convent and for the king, versus how this painting was received on this side of the Atlantic. Indigenous peoples who suffered at the hands of those same Spaniards found hope in this painting. You see, what they saw in this painting was a suffering Jesus who identified with them who were suffering. They see Jesus identifying with them. They see Jesus suffering with them, even as they suffer at the hands of the Spaniards. They identify with Jesus, but in the painting, we're also reminded that Jesus is identifying with them. That's the power of this painting. We find identification with Jesus in his suffering, even as he finds identification with us. This same kind of power is going on in Matthew chapter 25 that was just read moments ago by Oscar and Joshua. It's the story of the sheep and the goats. And it's all imagery. One of the interesting things, we're going to say a lot today about this particular story. One of the things that we have to remember about this sheep and the goats, some of you may have Bibles where it says the parable of the sheep and the goats. That's not really a parable. Parables were fictitious stories that were relayed by Jesus to talk about reality. But nowhere does he identify this as fictitious. He's using imagery. He's using metaphor. But the stuff he's describing is very, very real. It is not fictitious. The images of sheep and goats, going all the way back to Ezekiel and then some. It's all about judgment. This is Judgment Day. This is a judgment scene. The sheep and the goats and the king and all the different personalities that are going on in this particular story they are conveying some truths about what will happen at Judgment Day. Now, this story, the sheep and the goats, is popular. It's also controversial. In fact, you can get on the internet and you can crank in Matthew 25 and you're going to get all sorts of explanations for what's going on in this story. A lot of them are not having anything to do with what Jesus is saying. This thing has been misinterpreted. It's been taken out of context quite often. One thing, though, that is popular as far as this particular story that Jesus is telling, one way to think about this is that Jesus is saying your behavior determines whether or not you go to heaven or hell. That's a popular way to read this. But we have the entire Bible telling us that our behavior does not determine whether or not we are going to heaven or hell. Only Jesus determines this. And it's all in faith. We receive what Jesus has done for us in faith. There is no working our way into being a sheep. There is no working our way down into being a goat. Behavior does not determine our final destination. This story is not teaching that you better be good or else. That's one way to read this story. One thing to keep in mind, we've stated it already, is that this story is part of a long conversation that Jesus is having with his disciples, with his best friends, that very last night. Before he is going to then be arrested and then die for these disciples and die for this crowd that he's talking about. So the king in this story, we always have to remember, is also the shepherd that Ezekiel talks about, the shepherd who is going to die for the sheep. Just in a few short hours, they're going to crucify the creator of the world. So in this discussion, and this discussion is a long one, Jesus is answering some of their questions about what happens at the end of the world and what are some of the signs that we're supposed to be looking for. This story is the very last story, or the very last part of the conversation in which Jesus is saying and talking about, how does this all end? Where is this all going? So the question that we need to have as we come to this particular story is this. When the world is ending, what are we supposed to be doing? Sometimes it gets lost. It's very easy to come to this particular story, pull it out of its context, and start trying to understand what's going on in this story without recognizing this is part of a long conversation about the end of the world and what we're supposed to be doing or not doing when the world is coming to an end. What is it that we're supposed to be doing? This entire conversation, and this pace of the conversation, starts like this. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, that right there, Jesus is letting us know that this is taking place, this is going to happen, and we begin to think, when the Son of Man comes in all his glory, there are two ways to think about that as well. Some of it is in when Jesus is coming in his resurrection, but also at the very end of time. Second coming. So the scene that Jesus is painting is this is what happens when it's all done and there is this separation of sheep and goats, the final judgment. There's a king in this story. Jesus talks about nations. So this king, this shepherd, is the one who sets it all up on this final day. And he is separating the righteous and the righteous who are given these images. We're told what these images represent even in the story. The righteous and the unrighteous, or the sheep and the goats. And then there's a separation. The separation actually sets up two different stories that are going on within the one big story. What's happening with the sheep and then what's happening with the goats. Now he takes it one step further, because then, as he is separating sheep and goats, as his story progresses, there's this. There is a blessing. There is a promise tucked into all of this. It says, then the king will say to those on his right, these sheep that have been separated. That's how, then the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. We're going to come back to this. But this is a promise, this is a blessing set up. It sets up the whole story. Let's not forget that either. It becomes very easy for us to break this all down and fine-tune our lenses and scope in on, okay, here's what the sheep are doing, here's what the goats are doing, and then it becomes one big morality tale. We need to be acting like sheep rather than goats. When the gospel's here in the middle of it all. This promise is the one. Everything is orbiting around this promise. Come and inherit what's been promised to you. The inheritance, the kingdom. It's interesting. We come to this story, and I've done this, by the way, so I will say guilty as charged. How many of you come to this story and you got a preconceived notion of just who sheep are and who the goats are? We like doing this, right? I like doing this. We have our lists. These are the sheep, these are the goats. We know who they are. We're going to talk about this in a few seconds. But Jesus doesn't let us go there. This is not the purpose of this story. Jesus is not going to let us get comfortable with this idea that, hey, we're supposed to come to this story, we're supposed to, even in our minds, start separating sheep and goats. In fact, this story is nothing like we would say or do. And there is a shocking, shocking statement in the middle of it all that jolts us out of thinking that this is a story that helps us kind of understand, okay, those people are the sheep and those people are the goats. And here's the shocker. Jesus identifies himself as having 6 characteristics that we would never attach to Jesus. Jesus has 6 things in this story, both with sheep and goats. Jesus says, here, this is his list. Jesus says 6 things. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was a stranger. I was naked. I was sick. I was in prison. How many of us, when we think of Jesus that way? We don't. We're not expecting Jesus to say this. In fact, the king in this story is the one saying this. We tend to think of kings as, all righteous, all powerful, all glorious. And there are those pictures, those images of Jesus in our Bibles. But there's also shepherd. There's also suffering shepherd. And this story is painting that king this way. This is Jesus in this story. This king, who's dividing sheep and goats, says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger, I was naked, I was sick, I was in prison. And the fascinating thing is, if we're going to understand the story correctly, we're going to focus in on that list. Because if we've been reading the entire biography that Matthew has been writing, we've already seen this list. We've already seen this list. This is not a Jesus that we are comfortable talking about. You see, early on in Jesus' ministry, it says Jesus came for those who are hungry, who are thirsty, who are stranger. People are naked, people are sick. Oh, okay. So Jesus is among them. Now, if this list of Jesus isn't bizarre enough, then Matthew says this. The righteous, or the sheep now, going back and forth between calling them the righteous and calling them sheep. The righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? You know, this is amazing. The sheep, the righteous, are saying when. It's funny. Jesus has said, come, enjoy my blessing, enjoy the inheritance. You'd think the sheep in this story would just be all about that. All about getting those pats on the back. Hey, wait, we made it. We're sheep. We get to enjoy the kingdom. We get to enjoy the inheritance. We get to enjoy all of Christ's blessings. No, their answer to Jesus in this moment is when. There's some confusion in their minds. When did we do all these things? And we realize they didn't even know that they were addressing the needs of Jesus. They didn't know when they were serving Jesus. They want to know when. And I'm going to insert one more thing here. Not only do they not know when, if they don't know when they were serving Jesus, they don't know who. They don't know who. The sheep do not know who the sheep are. They don't know who the goats are. They don't know who the least are. They're simply serving Jesus. Again, it's very easy for us to come to a passage like this, and a text like this, a story like this, and immediately in our minds, because I know I've done it before, I want to do this, I immediately begin trying to think in my mind, okay, here are the sheep and here are the goats. And it's fascinating to me that Jesus is the one doing the separating. We have other parables that Jesus does tell. It says, leave the separating to me. Why? Because we're pretty judgmental. But it's fascinating to me that these people not only don't know when they were serving Jesus, they don't know who. They are simply serving. It could be a sheep, it could be a goat. They don't know. This is a fly in the ointment for those that think this is one big morality tale about how we need to feed the poor. They don't know they're doing it. They have to ask Jesus when. And that's when Jesus gives this famous line. Famous line is, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. In doing it for the least of these, whether they're sheep, whether they're goats, they don't know. They don't know it's Jesus they're serving. But whatever you did for the least of these, you did it for me. Well, who are the least of these? Well, we were just given that list. We were just given the list. Much has been made about the fact that Jesus, in answering the question, says, you do it for them, you're doing it for me. Jesus is, in fact, identifying with the least of these here. And there's no getting around the fact here that as we feed the least of these, as we serve the sick, as we do things for the least of these, we are doing it for Him. One of the reasons why I bring this up is because it's also very easy for some of us to come here and just kind of say, yeah, okay, that's good, that's stuff we need to be doing. But Jesus is really saying it's as if we did it for Jesus. He doesn't say that here. This act is much deeper. It's much more meaningful. Taking care of, again, Jesus when He is sick, Jesus when He's in prison, Jesus when He's a stranger. In serving strangers, it's not as if, again, not as if we did it for Jesus. No, Jesus says we actually do it to Jesus Himself. So the key to understanding all of this, the key to understanding what's happening in the division of sheep and the goats, and what Jesus says to both the sheep and the goats, is in that list. It's in that list. Again, Jesus says 6 things. I was hungry, thirsty, stranger, naked, sick, and in prison. And that list is a list that Matthew has already told us. These are the people that Jesus hangs with. Jesus was always being accused. You eat with sinners. You eat with the outcasts. At one point, Jesus stops the conversation and He says, I didn't come for the healthy, I came for the sick. I came for the sick. When Jesus first begins His ministry, this is what Matthew tells us. Jesus began to go over all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. Then the news about Him spread throughout Syria, so they brought to Him all those who were afflicted, those suffering from various diseases and intense pains, the demon-possessed, the epileptics, the paralytics, and He healed them. At the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, these are the people that He is ministering to. But along the way, again, it's easy for us to focus in on all the diseases and all the suffering going on down here. But at the very beginning, He is preaching the good news. He's preaching the gospel. The gospel of forgiveness, the gospel of salvation, the gospel of life go hand in hand with the effects. What we can't miss when we see something like this, that all the healing and all the stuff that Jesus is doing with the suffering and his identification with the suffering all happens as a result of the gospel. That good news. It's always in the context. And Matthew here is describing the good news of the kingdom and its effects. In fact, he's quoting from Isaiah. Isaiah says the Messiah would open blind eyes, bring out prisoners from the dungeons, and those sitting in darkness from the prison house. So the Messiah specifically came for those who are desperate, those who are sick, those who are strangers. In fact, John, Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, he sends some guys over to Jesus. He wants to report on what Jesus is doing. John is in jail, and I need a report on what Jesus is doing. You know what Jesus says? Matthew 11, Jesus replies to them, go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor told the good news. These are the people Jesus hangs with. The good news is transforming lives. The gospel is actually producing healing for people who are suffering and sick. So you see this list. I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was naked. I was a stranger. I was in prison. That list. Jesus is saying, I came for these people. I identify with these people. So much so, it is so ingrained in who Jesus is, that to serve this crowd with the gospel, with the proclamation of the gospel and all of its healing activities, that we are serving Jesus himself. We're involved in this kind of gospel ministry. You know, we can push back all we want against the notion that the church is to be identified with these kinds of people. And I've been in rooms, and I've been in conversations, I've been there, people do this. The church here is both blessed. They have this blessing. Come and receive the inheritance. You've been blessed. But the church has also, all along the way, wherever the gospel has been proclaimed, wherever there is word and sacrament ministry, the church has been providing for the physical needs of who? Well, sheep and goats. We don't know. But whenever we do, we're doing it to Jesus. It's always been this way. It's always been this way. The church and the gospel it preaches, who Jesus is, what he does for us in forgiveness, life, and salvation, all of that has as its effects this healing nature for the people who are listening in and receiving it in faith. And this goes beyond simply our spiritual healing. That's the other thing we can't do here. He's not simply talking about spiritual healing. It's easy for us to do that here as well. He's talking about providing for physical needs. Wherever the gospel is present, wherever the word is preached, wherever the sacrament is provided, wherever the gospel is going on, it has an effect on those receiving it. The people who need to hear it the most. The people who are most desperate. That doesn't mean, and Jesus had to say this a time or two, this doesn't mean it's not for the rich. That the gospel is not for everybody. The gospel is for everybody. But all of us need to see that the least of these includes all of us. In one way or another. All of us are the least of these in some capacity. So remember that first question we asked? What is it we're to be doing with our time? So we're going to come back to that. What is it that we're to be doing with our time? Why is it that we spend so much time both on gathering here on Sundays for word and sacrament? And why is it that we also spend our time taking care of our community as best we can. Because that is our vocation. Vocation, that's a fancy word. It gets thrown around in our society and in our culture. You say the word vocation, typically that simply means our job. But vocation is more than that. It's our lives. My vocation happens to be father, husband, and pastor. All of it is vocation. What is it that we're to be doing, all of us, with our vocation, wherever God has placed us? And He's placed us, there's 40 some out here, 40 different places where God's placed us. Where Jesus is working, Jesus is moving. We talked about every place that the church goes, everywhere you and I go, we bring Jesus into the context. So as we bring Jesus into the context, as we bring gospel into the context, we are bringing also water for the thirsty, food for the hungry, clothes for the naked. We're providing hospitality for the stranger. We do it in the context of the good news of Jesus Christ and His forgiveness, which is why you hear me say it over. In fact, you're going to hear me say it again today. I can't help myself. When we experience the forgiveness here, when we receive Jesus in His Word and we receive Jesus through His sacrament, He provides us forgiveness. And this forgiveness is forgiveness for us, but it then becomes forgiveness for our neighbor. It becomes forgiveness in our lives. The gospel has legs through us. This is how we provide for the least of these. You see, the gospel is at the heart of hospitality. So going back, it is here in this invitation, the one that we just mentioned, where we find identity. The King will say to those on His right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." We enter this world, we end up serving sheep and goats. We end up serving Jesus. We don't know who, we don't know when. We do this as blessed people. We do this as those who have been provided the inheritance of the kingdom. Yeah, there's going to be a finality of it at this last day. But as we read these words, Jesus isn't simply saying, "Oh, hey, this is all going to happen then." No, this is all happening now. I mean, it's just been a few days earlier that He said, "The kingdom is here. The kingdom is near wherever I am." So as we move into people's lives with the gospel and provision, we do it as people who are already blessed. You see, we're not doing this in order to get blessed. We already have been blessed. It's out of that blessing that we do all of these things. We do it for each other. And by the way, you guys do a great job of this. It's awesome. Providing for each other. We do it for ourselves. We do it for ourselves, for each other. We do it for the world. We do it for our neighbors. We do it for Los Fresnos. Here. It's from this position of being blessed by the good news that the church welcomes strangers. So that crucifixion that we saw, Jesus identifying with the suffering, identifying with the stranger, identifying with us, is also us identifying with Jesus in those moments. When we identify ourselves with the sick, when we identify ourselves with those in need, those who are strangers, we are identifying with Jesus. It's through us that Jesus is providing forgiveness and reconciliation to this world. Let's pray.